Okay, all right. Good morning, good afternoon, everywhere, and where you are. Um, Once again, my name is Hamid Abdulaziz, and today's topic. Today is first, 2nd of March, and today we'll be talking about the a hot topic and a great expert here, right?
Hmm.
So, the topic is going to be on the integrating Power Pages with the .NET um, API, right? So, and yeah, okay. So first, I'd like to introduce myself. Uh, Once again, my name is Hamid Abdulaziz. I'm an MVP business application and also a senior developer, and working with Avanade. And today, let me introduce my my colleague, also in the same place, and this is a wonderful guy, and then he's been an expert on this field for a very very long time. So, and I learned a lot from him as well. And today is going to talk about the integrating Power Pages with .NET based external APIs. And his name is Michel Mendes. Okay, he's also an MVP. So, but I would like him to introduce himself by himself. Okay, all right, Michel, thanks for coming, and I really appreciate your time. I know you've been quite busy, but I have to just make sure that I bring you here and to discuss this hot topic. And so we want to tap from your knowledge, from your skills, and from your. It's going to be resourceful for us and for all the community as well. Okay, all right. So, um, okay, Michel, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ahmed. It's great to be here, man. So, like as Ahmed was saying, I work with him at Avanade, and I'm also a business applications MVP, an MVP in business applications, and also in Microsoft 365. And I'm gonna be explaining a little bit here on, how you can use external APIs in Power Pages, why you would use it, and the behind the scenes configurations you need to do to enable everything. So, great to be
Yeah,
here. Yeah.
yeah, good. Thanks so much for that. So I think I'd say a lot of people trying to, and they actually are interested in this particular topic, and so especially when it's commonly what we mentioned .NET based external API. So it's kind of interesting that people want to know how to integrate how this work with Power Pages. A lot of people are doing a couple of things regarding external APIs with web pages and all of that. But Power Pages seems to be not something that's not common to a lot of people. And because I've seen people approaching me about this topic, and then so I believe today you're gonna do justice to this, and myself you're gonna learn from it as well, right? So, all right, thanks, Michelle. So now I can bring you on stage for your presentation
Yep.
if you're ready. Okay,
All right.
all
Okay.
right.
Okay. So as we said, I'm going to be talking about how you can integrate Power Pages with .NET external APIs. Just one thing. Yep. Before I begin the presentation, just a better introduction about myself. So like as Hamed said, I'm a senior consultant at Avanade. I'm an MVP in M365 apps and business applications. I have been in the IT field since 2008, and I started my career actually as a .NET developer. Then I started working with SharePoint, and now currently I am working only with Power Platform and a little bit of Microsoft 365 integrated with Power Platform. And I am from Brazil, and since 2018, I'm living in Dublin, in Ireland. If you want to follow me and see my content or get in touch, you can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Like in both social networks, you can find me by the handle Michel Carlo. Okay. So the agenda for today. First, I am going to just explain a little bit on the pro code extensibility options for Power Pages. Then why we would use APIs and why we would be authenticating in external APIs. An overview of the process to connect to external APIs, and then the basics of what is the token format we use to connect to external APIs, the need of a custom certificate to connect to external APIs. And before I do my demo, I would like also to explain a little bit of the process that I implemented in this demo so it makes sense for everybody to be on the same page and follow all the steps and why did I implement it using a custom API. And then finally, a demo about everything. So I would be using Pro Code extensibility in Power Pages. Even though Microsoft promotes Power Pages to be a low-code um, website development tool, like you can do a lot only configuring entity lists, basic forms, and multi-step forms. It's really good to spin up pages and forms very quickly, but the only problem is if you need to customize the pages a lot, the customization options are limited. You can still do a lot. So like you can use JavaScript and jQuery to customize field behavior, maybe inject elements and do things that you cannot do out of the box. But the main problem is that you are stick to the whole structure of the forms and the list views that you have out of the box. You can also customize styling with CSS, but you need to be able to customize layouts just by applying styles on existing elements that are generated by Microsoft with entity lists and the forms. And if by any reason next week Microsoft changes how those lists work and changes the order of HTML elements or names of native CSS classes, your custom CSS that is applied on top of out of the box features will break. So it's important to have that in mind. So then why we would be using full code pro development in Power Pages instead of maybe building a custom website externally to connect to Dataverse? So, obviously you could maybe do a website in React or only C# MVC, any other web application pro development tools. But the advantage is if you do it on top of Power Pages, we don't need to develop connections to Dataverse again. You don't need to redevelop security. Everything is already developed for you. So you simply have to use the liquid code or JavaScript to access data, and like all the table permissions model is already out of the box applied to anything you do. So basically, if you set up data in a way that a user should see only what they have configured via table permissions, they cannot bypass it via Liquid and Web API. It respects the security model. It's really quick to build pages on top of Dataverse data, even though you need to maybe do some learning on Liquid to build server-side customizations. But like JavaScript is some common language that we use in every SaaS system customization that is around, like SharePoint or model-driven apps and anything. It's easy to integrate it with model-driven apps because of that, because you already have an easy way to access Dataverse via JavaScript or via Liquid. So it's easy to send data from one to the other. Like if you want customers to send data and access data on the back office, it's easy. If you want the contrary as well, so like if you want external users to be able to see data that you want them to access externally, easy to do as well. What are now the Pro Code extensibility options we have in Power Pages? If you want to do server-side customizations, we have Liquid as a powerful language that we can use to create custom web templates and custom pages. We can run very complex fetch XML queries and render the pages as we wanted on top of fetch XML, for example. But the disadvantage is that Liquid is used only to render content. So you cannot use Liquid to do updates or change data. So it has to be used only to create pages to exhibit data. You can then use JavaScript or jQuery to do any full client-side customizations. You can even create PCF components in Power Pages. And in combination with JavaScript and jQuery, you can then use Power Pages Web API, which is very powerful. You can do a lot with that, but it has a few missing operations. For example, you cannot run custom unbound actions that you guys normally use to create custom APIs on the back end for Dataverse. You can actually call bound actions, but usage is a bit limited. And you cannot perform batch requests like transactional requests as you do with the C# SDK. You can obviously do actions in bulk by controlling how you call the web API queries and running actions in batch on top of a lot of objects, but it's not going to be transactional as you have when you run a transaction request in C# code using a plugin, for example. Then on top of this, we have all those options to customize Power Pages. We have Liquid, we have JavaScript. Why we would then want to use the C# APIs to extend Power Pages? The first is you can then develop C sharp um, C sharp custom code on the background of anything you build on Power Pages. Like you can do actions that you usually wouldn't be able to do via JavaScript, and you can connect to external services. So, for example, you could then create an API that connects to SharePoint using app-only access. That's something you cannot do easily with Power Automate, right? You can run server-side code from Power Pages, as I said, without having to do plugin workarounds or maybe some restrictions to overcome Power Pages constraint. And important thing I mentioned, if you want to use an API to run SDK calls to Dataverse, you can do those calls that are not supported out of the box in Power Pages Web API. So you can then develop your custom API that connects to Dataverse SDK and run bulk operations and treat everything as transactions if you need. And in some cases as well, even though you can do the operations with the Power Pages Web API, you can set up table permissions on top of Dataverse, so you can allow the operations from the Web API to be somehow limited, but you can only enable the operations to be limited in a sense of, if a user has access to a record, then the user can read the record or update or create records in that table, or assign, how can I say, append records to another table, but you cannot limit what are the exact values that the user can assign to a field or things like that. You can even enable or disable fields with column permissions in Power Pages, but it's just tied to a profile. For example, if I have a web role of administrator, then I could update a certain field in a table. If I don't have that role, I couldn't. But sometimes you need more than that. Sometimes you need to, like, a person can send a submission and change the status to submitted, but never change the status field to approved. And then that's something you could implement with a custom web API. So, for example, we could create a custom web API that simply gets the record ID, changes the status of it on the background to submitted, but you cannot change the status to anything else. Okay. In some projects and some posts around, sometimes you see people using Azure functions instead of custom web APIs. And if you don't authenticate properly with with an authentication token, sometimes people simply use Azure functions with a function key, and that's not the most secure way. That's not a best practice to run from client side. So, like, if you want to call an Azure function from JavaScript in Power Pages, you can do it, but you're gonna have to expose it only with a key. And if someone grabs that key somehow by just investigating your page in developer tools in Chrome, then the key is exposed and they can maybe hack your page and hack your content and use the functions as they shouldn't. You can actually use Azure API management to validate tokens, but it is more expensive. So, bear in mind, maybe if the budget allows you to use APIM, it's better. You can still use the Power Pages tokens to secure your function calls, but it is more expensive. But obviously, as it is more expensive, it's going to have more advanced features, such as you can limit how many calls you do via by a specific token per time or things like that. So you can, maybe easily enable one token to be used one time, or maybe from the same user to call the same endpoint only, 2 times a minute, or things like that. It's really straightforward to implement, but it is more expensive. And as I mentioned as well, we are going to be developing, explaining the concept of using web APIs to extend Power Pages. And as I was mentioning, to be more secure, we need to authenticate when we call external APIs. And how can we do it? We can leverage the OAuth to implicit flow feature from Power Pages. That OAuth implicit flow generates an identity token that can be then used to communicate with external APIs. Those APIs can then validate the token that's generated by Power Pages so they can see who is the user. They validate that the call was made by a portal user, what is the portal calling the API, and then they can actually add more security validations on top of it, such as validate how long ago was the token generated. So if, let's say, if the token is expired, the call can be blocked and things like that, right? Then how do we use this token exactly? So basically, from JavaScript, we will be doing a post request to this endpoint slash services slash auth slash token. When you get the token, you send it to the request you make to the API. Then your API would be validating cores, validating if the token is valid, if it's not expired, if it has the appropriate scope and audience. It can validate the token by getting the token signature from portals. So it's going to validate the token by retrieving the public key signature from this address slash services slash auth slash public key. If the token is valid, I send the API send a response. If it's not valid, automatically the user is going to get an unauthorized error. You can add inside of the C# methods some extra validations to validate if the user actually has permissions to do the actions that they are trying to do. So let's say if everything is okay, you return a response to the JavaScript code from the API. One thing that is important to know as well is if you want to validate the token with a public key like this, your Power Page site needs to be public. Otherwise, the token signature validation will fail because the API cannot access the public key. Okay. In the token format, it's not customizable. The token generated by that OAuth to implicit flow endpoint, but it's good that it's independent from any authentication method used. So like regardless if it's Azure B2C, if it's local authentication in Power Pages, that's fine. The token is going to be generated the same way. You don't have to worry too much. And you can use the claim sub in the token to match who is calling your API to a portal contact, okay? You can also use the email address in the portal contact if you prefer. And at the end of the token, you also have the token audience and who is the issuer, and those are factors you can use to generate to apply more security in the API calls. So what happens is like this token I'm showing you guys is that it's decoded. So let's say your API is going to receive the token, validate, decrypt it using that signature that you can get from the specific Power Pages site, and then you extract all the data you need, right? As I said, you match the portal contact with the subclaim. But in order to enable everything like this, you need to add custom certificates into the Power Page site you want to enable the authentication. So basically, you need to go to the Power Pages Admin Center and upload the certificate with the format required by Microsoft. That's a point that I'm not a very good specialist. So like I simply, when I need certificates, I get them generated by someone else, by a specialist for me, and then I get it converted and apply to my site. So if you guys need to do the same or want to do the same in your projects, I strongly advise you to talk to a specialist that is, more, how can I say, has more expertise in token security and generation. But then, okay, now that we've been through what's needed on the background to enable the API integration, just a quick overview of the process I created and that I'm gonna demo. The idea here is I am gonna create a custom record via the Power Pages Web API. I grab that record ID and I am gonna send from a form that I have in the page, like it's a page where I submit custom files to blob storage. So basically, I am gonna save in Dataverse only the the name of the submission, and I have a input field where I'm gonna upload the file. And if my submission saving is successful, I'm gonna grab the base64 contents from that upload field. I then get the, as I said, get the ID of the item that I simply saved using Dataverse Web API, grab the blob content, send it into my custom API. My custom API then validates the token, connects to Dataverse using app registration. So I have my app secret saved on Key Vault, so I don't need to be saving everything on configurations. My API also is using Dataverse SDK, so it has only the permissions it needs. So I granted the API permissions only to update that entity that I need. If the user, the API checks on Dataverse. If the user is not the owner of the record, I return an unauthorized error via code. If the user is the owner of the record, I then grab that blob content, save it into blob storage, grab the URL of the blob, save it into Dataverse via API, and I send the response into JavaScript. So basically, when I send the response to JavaScript, I'm just confirming that the item was saved, but I never expose my blob URL. So the URL is accessible only from Dataverse or a model-driven app. When I send the response and it's successful, I process it via JavaScript. So mainly, I've chosen to demo this using blob storage because it's simple to explain the concept, and the amount of code to make it work is very short. So basically, it's just a matter of listing and uploading files to blob storage. But the same concept can be applied to other file sources. So like you can use a custom API to connect to SharePoint and develop your custom SharePoint integration instead of using the out-of-the-box Power Pages integration. So for example, you want to create your own SharePoint sites structure with your own columns and whatever, you can do it and then use an API to expose it to Power Pages. And now finally, the demo. Let me go through how this works and how it was implemented on the background. So here on my Power Pages site, there is just a simple web page that retrieves records from a table that I have here named submissions. As I mentioned, I list all the submissions assigned to the current user, and I list the submissions by name, date they were created, and I have a Dataverse field, a calculated field that is based on the item having a blob URL or not. So if the item has a blob URL, it means I have a file that I can enable to download. So basically, I don't show the URL itself, but I show that it has a file available to download, right? When I click this button, download here, I'm simply going to send the current item ID as a GUID into my custom.NET API, and the API processes the request, validates if the user has permissions to download the file, and if I click this, I see the downloaded file. And the same happens for the uploads. So I have a simple form, very basic entity with one field only, and I can upload a file here. When I click Save Changes, it calls Power Pages Web API, saves the item, I grab the item ID, and that item ID is sent into my custom Web API together with the contents of my blob. So my API grabs the blob content, gets the item ID, checks if I have permissions to save that value in the field, and uploads the blob content. When everything is processed, I get a warning saying that the file is created, and I reload my page here. So I simply can come here and see that I uploaded my file with the date of today, and I can download it if I want. So it's just a simple PDF. I'm just uploading the same demonstration file. And how was this implemented on the background? As I mentioned, there's a lot of settings you need to do first. So the first one is if you go to I'm just gonna close the other tabs. If you go to the Power Pages sites list inside of Power Platform Admin Center, you find your website. Then there's that option, Custom Certificates. You can upload your certificate here. In my case, I already uploaded it, so I won't do it again because it's already everything set up. But let's say if you want to upload the new certificate to enable the OAuth through implicit flow, you simply come here and you click New, upload your file. And if you want, you need to grab this thumbprint value to use it later. So you basically need to copy it somehow, even though you can't from the UI, but easily you can use the inspect function in Chrome, where you can grab the value from HTML elements and you copy this value to use in the site settings later. Okay. So you uploaded certificate, you grabbed the thumbprint value, and now you have to add it into Power Pages site settings. If you head to the site settings, here in the site settings list, I already pre-filtered the list of settings needed for this demonstration. So the first one you need to edit is this that I was mentioning. You add a new site setting named custom certificate / implicit grant flow, and you paste the value from that certificate thumbprint. After that, you have to also add the client ID you're going to use for both the JavaScript call and for the validation of the token in the API. So in my case, I added a registered client ID with the name of PP Web API Demo. And I also configured a custom token expiration time for 60 seconds. So basically, after 1 minute, the token is going to expire and it doesn't work again. So, if someone intercepts the API calls, grabs the token, it's not going to be working after 1 minute. And for the web API calls, I've only enabled the fields I explicitly need in my JavaScript calls. So it's recommended that you enable only the fields you explicitly need to use. So for instance, the field with my blob URL, it's not exposed here for my submission table. Okay. Once you enable this in the site settings, there's actually one step I forgot to show, guys. Like I showed, you uploaded it from the portal side, but how do you see it on a model-driven app? So I see this in a model-driven app where users had added submissions. It's a very basic model-driven app just to show a table with the data from that table in Dataverse. So let's say if I submitted the file from a portal, I can simply open my model-driven app and see my available blobs to download. I click the link and it downloads from a model-driven app what was submitted into the portal. So like the things tied together. A portal user sends data, someone in the model-driven app side can see, or vice versa. So if someone wanted to add a blob link for a user to download, it would work as well using this API. And now that you have set up all those settings, there's some steps you need to add to your code. So in my example here, from the Power Pages site itself, I'm running all those actions from JavaScript, as I mentioned. And just a second. I have a JavaScript function created here just to return the results of getting a token into the OAuth to token generation endpoint from Power Pages. And to get that token, I need to send the client ID that I am trying to get a token. So if I use a client ID here that doesn't exist in Power Pages in the web settings, I will get an error when trying to get a token. So they have to be a token that is valid, client ID that is valid to retrieve a token. Okay. And what the page does is this is the JavaScript code for that whole page I just showed. When I load the page, I run this load my submissions function. That function then calls my web API to read data from those columns I enabled. So I do a GET request to the web API, retrieve the data, and then I process the data adding into a table in the page. So I simply you know, go through all the records that I got from the web API, generate table rows, and inside of the row generation, I simply check if my item has upload field set as true. I add a button into the field, and that button, on the click of it, it has a function that's called get upload blob, receiving as a parameter the item ID. What happens in the get upload blob function is that I can that send the item ID to the get upload function. That upload get upload function gets the token to authenticate in the API, and I call my API generation my API with my endpoint that I generated with my submission ID. So basically, I send a request to the API. API processes the request, checks if I have access to, and it gives me back an object that has contents and a file name. And there's a simple function that is used to simply use to download the content as base64, and then I send the file name and the content of it. It generates the item to download in the screen and auto clicks it to download. Then I get the file that was in the blob storage. And to do the upload, the process is similar to this. So from the form that I just clicked, that's a very basic bootstrap model with the text field and the input field. I grab then the file name from what was in the input field. I get what was the file content from that uh, from that input field result, and I send a request to my API. So actually, there's just one step I forgot to show. Like before calling it, I saved the item in the web API. Actually, I saved the item with the name that I added to the text field, grab the ID, then I call the function to call the web API, sending my token, all the details, right? If everything is successful, then I reload the submissions and it refreshes the page. But inside of the web API, what happens is if I'm gonna show you now like everything from JavaScript, I generate the stuff with the web API, I get the token, I send the data to the web API. Inside of the web API itself, it's the most important piece. So in the web API program.cs, that's what controls the starting of the web API. That's a simple MVC C# web API project. I've added this simple this extension function to process the setup of portal authentication. So inside of this, what happens is I enable for any method in the web API, I enable them to use authentication, and when they are when they have the annotation of authorized on top of it, they are gonna use the authentication that I set up using this method. That basically the the method connects to my Power Pages site that I set in the configuration. So I grab the public key that's used to decrypt tokens for that Power Pages site. I do the parsing using standard .NET classes to parse security tokens. And instead of my validation parameters, inside of my validation parameters, I have some options that I can enable. So like I validate the issuer, I validate lifetime, validate the audience of the token, validate the signing key and everything. It's not required like to put all those validations, but the more you add, the more secure your API calls will be, right? So by doing this, you simply enable your API methods to be using authentication. But that's step number one. So you add this to your web API, you pre-enable it in your methods. In the web API controllers, that's where you enable the methods where you expose externally. You also need to add the annotation authorize to make it a method that requires authentication. So basically, if you don't add it, it won't require authentication. But sometimes that's not enough. In this case, for example, in the post method, that's what I use to call to send the blob and update the Dataverse records. I get the submission ID, and I have a Dataverse a custom utility class that's a wrapper to call the Dataverse SDK, where I basically send the ID of the item. I run inside of the method here a query expression to retrieve all the fields and everything from that record using the Dataverse SDK, like the same as you would use in a plugin, for example. And then after I retrieve the record, what can I do with this? I get the record and I can see if that portal contact for that record is the same contact that I have for the current user. So if it's not the same contact for the current user, it means in this instance, I'm blocking the access because it was not submitted by the user. So they shouldn't be doing uploads there. Okay. And if I block the access, I simply return an unauthorized um, access result to the user. Here again, after everything is validated, if the user has access to, I won't block the execution of the method. And then I do some parsing just to convert the base64 content that was sent from Power Pages into bytes, upload it to blob, and then again, I have a Dataverse wrapper that I use to call and update the blob URL in that item. So I simply call this wrapper to simply do an update of a field that's not exposed by Power Pages. It's just through this API here. And if I come back, if it's everything successful, I return the OK object results into the JavaScript web API with a message saying that the file was created. And the same, as I implemented this to validate the request. When I'm trying to send data, I can do the same when I'm trying to obtain data. So if a user tries to download the file, I can do the same type of validation. So if the user trying to download the file is not the portal contact for that record, I block it. Otherwise, I simply send the data to the blob storage and download my blob content. So I think that's it, Ahmed. I tried to summarize it a little bit due to the delay that we had caused to the issue. So like I'd like to see maybe if there's any questions I can go through and explain a bit more. I think it would be better. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Michel. That's a great one, and then really appreciate your time. And this is wonderful, and then it's great to learn from this as well. I think there are a couple of questions that have
Yep.
been posted, and here one of it is that just a second, let's try to grab it here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and just give me seconds. Trying to grab it. Okay, let me try to grab it from here. Okay. So one of the questions is, how do you use Azure Pages as SaaS application? I don't understand this question. Yeah, how do you use Azure Pages as SaaS application? I'm not sure that question is. Yeah, but let me. Yeah, I'm not sure that question is correctly. Okay, there's another one here. They say, how can we connect NHS digital API to Azure Pages?
No, how can what? Sorry, what's the
Or
question?
maybe they're trying to talk about Power Pages. How can we connect NHS digital API to Azure Pages?
Can you show me
Probably this could
can
be,
maybe send the question here in the chat because I
yeah. If you look at the comment, click on the comment section there. See that.
yeah.
Okay, this is not correct.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just copy this. Do you see this question on screen?
Connect NHS digital API to Azure Pages.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what's NHS digital API, but the thing is, if you can connect to this API using .NET, like first step is find out how to connect to that API using .NET, and then maybe you create a wrapper API, like your Power Pages call a custom .NET API that calls these NHS API. That's how I see it. I'm not sure what's this API, but it could be used in that way. Like if it doesn't allow, because if it's an external API that doesn't allow calling from from JavaScript or whatever, it has other ways. So like let's give an example. Like if you have if you're gonna use sometimes custom payments providers for Power Pages, you need to do the same. You know, you have your C# SDKs doing all the job, and you simply call the APIs from Power Pages. It's the same idea. So you have to create a web API using someone else's SDK and wrap it the same way as I did with the blob storage. Blob storage was just an example to simplify stuff, but it could be used to connect to anything else. You know, if you can handle it in
Yeah,
C#,
sure.
you can put it on the web API and handle the results.
Oh, okay, good, good. Right, another question. Oh, sorry, note here. How we connect? How to connect OData API with Power Pages?
If it requires authentication, it could be the same idea. You connect it via .NET, and then like you have a bridge API in the middle. But if it doesn't require authentication, you can simply connect it via JavaScript directly in the Power Page. You don't need to have the .NET API in the middle to do that process. It really
Good.
depends on the API you are going to call, you know, because if it doesn't require authentication, it's fine. It's simply jQuery and JavaScript to do it.
All right, good. And that's fine, good. I think that's all. And from the question that I have here, I think, yeah, that's a good one. All right, thanks so much, Michel. I know you're busy
No
there
problem.
out there, so I really appreciate your time. And this is great, and it's very resourceful, very skillful for us to learn from things as well. And me myself, I'm gonna watch over the video again, so and so that I can see what there. All right, thank you guys for everyone, and really appreciate your time and for this. Okay, for the recording, you can get the recording available later today or probably during the week as well. All right. So, and that's it for today. All right. Thank you so much and have a
Thanks,
good
guys.
time. Good then.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye. Okay.
Good.
Bye.